Hidden beneath the scorching Egyptian sun are secrets rarely discussed even by archaeologists themselves. Deep mines, vanished cities, strange structures, and traces of lost cults, all of this forms a frightening mosaic of the past. Egypt holds too many questions, and every artifact discovered seems to reinforce the feeling that we are only seeing the surface of a much more ancient history. Osirion of Abydos, strange architecture. The most unusual aspect of the Osirion has always been its style. It's completely unlike the surrounding temple dedicated to Seti I. There, the walls are decorated with delicate reliefs, neat inscriptions, and a clear structure. But here, huge roughly hewn stone slabs resemble cyclopean masonry, each block weighing tens of tons. They are joined in such a way that the gaps are almost invisible, creating an impression of antiquity that defies conventional notions of Egyptian architectural development. Standing at the very edge of the platform, where the still water collects at the bottom of the structure, a strange sense of timelessness arises. The water doesn't appear here by chance. The groundwater level constantly rises and falls, as if the place itself is trying to retain something hidden. Researchers have repeatedly tried to explain this with simple geology, but the sense of mysticism remains, especially when the water becomes almost mirror-like, reflecting the heavy stones like a memory of bygone eras. Many have wondered why the architecture of Osirion is so different from everything else around it. Some have suggested that the builders deliberately returned to some ancient style to emphasize the sacredness of the site. Others have speculated that the structure may have been much older than the surrounding buildings, and that the Temple of Seti I was simply erected nearby, unwilling to destroy what was considered sacred. These views remain controversial, but every time one sees this contrast, the idea of ancient times seems unexpectedly compelling. There are archaeologists working here in the early 20th century describe the Osirion as part of a funerary complex, but they also acknowledge that the construction methods were too archaic for the era. They often emphasize that the style was reminiscent of a time when Egyptian architecture was still in its infancy, which has sparked much debate. How could such a structure have appeared next to a temple built during the mature period of Egyptian history? This question remains open, and the more time passes, the more attention it attracts. If you stare at stone slabs bearing tool marks for a long time, you'll notice that they're virtually uniform in depth and direction. This has led to speculation about the extraordinary skill of ancient builders. You catch yourself thinking that this isn't just a stone, but the marks of hands that worked here thousands of years ago, and did so with a precision difficult to replicate even with modern tools. In such moments, time seems to compress. The Osirion is also striking in its layout. A rectangular hall sits in the center, surrounded by stone ledges and galleries. Everything is arranged as if important rituals were performed here, requiring a specific movement of people around the central space. This creates the impression of a hidden function, the nature of which we can only guess. Some believe the structure served as a symbolic burial place for Osiris, but this is far from certain, and there is no clear evidence. The most impressive thing about the Osirion is the feeling that you're standing before a structure that not everyone knew about. It's astonishing how hidden it is. If it weren't for the famous temple nearby, it might have been discovered much later. You look down at these heavy stone blocks and understand why the Osirion has become one of the most enigmatic buildings in Egypt. It's too unusual, too out of the ordinary, too ancient in its atmosphere. It seems as if two worlds have converged here: the familiar Egypt, studied and understood, and another, deep, heavy, silent, holding a secret no one can articulate. And when you leave, this silence lingers behind you, as if watching you with cold interest. Underground galleries of Saqqara animals. When you first descend into the underground passages of Saqqara, you feel as if you're crossing the boundary between the living and a long-vanished world. There are no brightly painted murals here, like in royal tombs. Instead, there are narrow corridors leading off into darkness and a vast number of niches that once held thousands of animals, mummified for ancient rituals. The very air seems heavier, as if saturated with the remnants of centuries of silence. These galleries served more than just as a place to store mummies. They were part of a religious system in which each animal played a special role. The most famous was the gallery dedicated to the Apis bull, considered the embodiment of strength and sacred energy. But there were also corridors filled with mummies of ibises, cats, dogs, falcons, and even rare crocodiles. All of them participated in rituals involving petitions to the gods, protection, and hope for the favor of higher powers. Looking at the massive walls carved from the soft stone, one can imagine how priests once moved here. They lit their way with oil lamps, creating strange reflections on the walls that transformed the space into a living corridor of shadows. You understand that this place was closely associated with ideas about the transition between the world of humans and the world of the gods, and the role of animals in these ideas was far more profound than is commonly believed today. The sheer scale of the entire complex seems particularly bizarre. At times, the galleries seem to stretch on forever, and the number of niches is simply impossible to count. They extend to the sides, intersect, and form entire levels. Archaeologists who began their explorations in the early 20th century were amazed at the sheer volume of work required to create such a vast network of underground passages. Even with modern tools, such work would have taken years, but here, everything was done by hand. The most puzzling question remains why the ancient Egyptians devoted so much attention to animal mummies. On the one hand, this is attributed to religious rites and sacrifices. On the other, the volumes are so vast that one gets the feeling that there was more to the matter than ritual. Perhaps there was a system of priestly training here, or a special sanctuary where ancient rites, the meaning of which has long been lost, were practiced. You sense this when you look at the thousands of empty niches receding into the darkness. The gallery is also surprised with their acoustics. Every step echoes with a strange hum that seems out of proportion to the size of the room. Sometimes it seems as if the sound is reflected not by the walls, but from the depths hidden behind them. Researchers attribute this to the peculiarities of the rock, but the silence here is too dense, as if the space were deliberately designed to heighten the sense of an unseen presence. You walk slowly, trying not to disturb this tense atmosphere. In some parts of the galleries, inscriptions and simple symbols have been preserved. They resemble markings made for internal use by priests, directions, numbers of mummies, indications of animal species. But among these markings are also more mysterious signs, the meaning of which no one can now determine. Some believe them to be markings of the priestly schools. Others believe them to be part of initiation rituals. Regardless, they reinforce the sense that actions not intended for the common eye took place here. The enormous sarcophagi of the Apis bulls are particularly impressive. They are carved from solid blocks of stone so heavy that modern engineers struggle to imagine how they were transported underground. Some weigh over several tons, and the lids are so precisely crafted, as if they were manufactured not by ancient craftsmen, but by modern manufacturers. Standing next to them, you sense a scale that seems unbearable even today. Sometimes archaeologists found the remains of wooden boxes inside the niches, containing mummified small animals. They were wrapped in cloth, with traces of resin. These small relics seem particularly human. You understand that each mummy was prepared with care and reverence. These were not mere sacrifices. They were an attempt to communicate with the divine world, in which animals played the role of intermediaries. When you leave the underground galleries, a strange sense of melancholy remains. Saqqara has always been a place of transition between the land of the living and the land of the dead. But it is here, in the subterranean corridors of animal mummies, that this transition is felt especially keenly. It is as if you have passed through a long-forgotten world that continues to live in silence beneath a thick layer of sand, awaiting someone who will once again recall its secrets. Labyrinth of Kavr Herodotus. Standing before the pyramid in Hawara, you don't initially feel anything unusual. It looks like just another ancient structure, partially destroyed by time and wind. But recall the words of Herodotus, who described a gigantic labyrinth with thousands of chambers next to this pyramid. And it's as if a second, invisible world opens up before you. Researchers have tried to confirm these words, and this is where the real mystery begins. According to the ancient travelers' descriptions, the labyrinth was so vast that it surpassed even the great temples. He spoke of 12 majestic courtyards, numerous chambers, and a much more complex and inaccessible underground section. These words could easily be dismissed as exaggeration, were it not for the strange traces around the pyramid, which hint at the existence of a much larger structure than can be seen today. Around Hawara are the remains of stone platforms, mounds covered in rubble, and fragments of foundations that look as if a long structure actually stood here. You can almost see the outlines of corridors long buried underground. Some archaeologists believe that the labyrinth actually existed, but was dismantled in antiquity when the stone was used for other structures. This theory seems plausible, but it doesn't explain the strange silence with which the entire complex disappeared. What remains most intriguing is that the underground portion of the labyrinth remains virtually unexplored. Excavations were conducted in the early 20th century, but the high groundwater level made them nearly impossible. All that remains are massive stone blocks, arranged as if they were part of a vast structure. You realize that the most important remains hidden beneath the water and silt, as if the ancient world itself does not wish to reveal its secrets. When you stand next to a pyramid, the sheer scale of the space itself is daunting, as if a vast space could lie beneath your feet. It's difficult to imagine endless corridors leading off into darkness, but Herodotus's words ring so confidently that it's impossible to dismiss them. He rarely indulged in outright fabrications, so his descriptions continue to generate controversy. Some researchers believe he saw only part of the complex, and his impressions made the scale seem even more grandiose. Another theory suggests that the labyrinth may have been not only a ritual structure, but also a unique archive. Herodotus mentioned halls containing records covering many generations of Egyptian rulers. If this is true, the loss of the labyrinth would be one of the most tragic losses of ancient heritage. Imagine thousands of scrolls that could have shed light on forgotten eras, vanished countries, and events that we would speak of very differently today. Sometimes fragments of columns and slabs are found near Hawara that appear remarkably carefully crafted. They seem to belong to a highly skilled structure. Such finds only reinforce the sense that beneath the surface lies a complex crafted with astonishing precision. Standing amid the sand and rubble, you realize that before you are the remains of not just an ordinary building, but something that required a tremendous amount of labor and expertise. The stories of local residents passed down from generation to generation are also intriguing. They spoke of a stone city underground, supposedly separate from the pyramid, but connected to it by hidden passages. While such stories are difficult to verify, they surprisingly match the descriptions of ancient authors. This makes one wonder, perhaps something truly remains hidden deep within, simply waiting for technology to allow it to be uncovered. Standing next to Hawara, you feel a strange tension in the space. The pyramid appears modest, but therein lies its most terrifying feature. It seems like just a key, a small visible fragment of a much larger mechanism. Mentally extending the lines of the underground passages, you imagine a structure that is impossible to grasp with your mind, a labyrinth created not to be found, but to live its own hidden life. And as you walk away from the pyramid, you get the faint feeling that you've passed by something enormous and ancient, something that lies underground, quietly awaiting its time. Herodotus may have been mistaken in the details, but the sense of scale and mystery that Hawara evokes is undeniable. This labyrinth, whether found or lost, lives on in the shadows of history, and its silence seems far louder than any words. The sunken city of Thonis Heracleion. When you board a boat to reach the spot where Thonis Heracleion lies beneath the water, it's hard to imagine that a vast port city once stood here. Ancient records mention it as a vital trading hub, welcoming ships from all over the Mediterranean. Now, however, the surface reveals only a calm expanse of water, concealing a history hidden for centuries. This place immediately inspires a sense of respect and awe. When archaeologists first lowered their equipment to the bottom, they saw stone columns, ruined walls, fragments of statues, and the remains of shrines. All of this lay so quietly and neatly, as if the city hadn't been destroyed, but simply dropped whole into the water. Looking at the underwater footage, you realize that these aren't chaotic ruins, but actual streets, squares, and temples, as if frozen in the moment of destruction. The water gave them a soft, almost ghostly shadow that doesn't exist on dry land. The strangest mystery of Thonis Heracleion has always been the cause of its disappearance. Archaeologists theorize that the destruction was caused by a combination of natural factors, ground shifts, rising sea levels, and earthquakes. But these explanations don't provide a complete sense of clarity. The city sank too gently to the bottom. It seems as if, rather than being destroyed by a storm, it somehow slowly sank into the soft earth until it ended up underwater. It seems as if the earth itself decided to hide it. The enormous statues of gods found underwater are particularly impressive. They lie on the sandy bottom, covered in silt, but their shape is so well preserved that it seems as if they were installed in the square just yesterday. You see the faces of the gods calmly gazing toward the surface, and you experience a strange feeling, as if they are watching those who are trying to return them to the world. These statues inspire respect with their magnitude and silent power. Thonis Herakleion was once the first port of call for foreign ships entering the Nile estuary. Cargo inspections, payments, and religious ceremonies associated with the maritime cult took place here. You can almost hear the hustle and bustle of the ancient port, the smell of resin, the cries of merchants. But all that life has vanished, leaving behind only a stone skeleton lying in the dark water. And the more you look at the underwater photographs, the stronger the feeling that the city was waiting to be seen again. What seems especially strange is that ancient texts mentioned Thonis Herakleion for a long time, but its exact location remained unknown. You realize it was practically a legend until it was discovered under a layer of sand and water. This adds a special mystique. A city that disappeared so long ago that its existence was debatable suddenly reappeared on instrument screens, as if reminding us of its existence. Researchers have discovered underwater remains of sanctuaries where important religious rituals took place. Slabs with inscriptions dedicated to gods, fragments of ritual objects, and even small boats used during ceremonies were found at the seabed. All of this provides an insight into the city's significance for the ancient Egyptians. Each discovery seems to bring to the surface another fragment of the forgotten life that once flourished here. Certain areas of the city are particularly impressive. Paved roads, the remains of canals, stone platforms where important buildings once stood. The water preserves them like a glass display case. You realize that before, you are not just ruins but frozen history, a place that can be studied for centuries. And the longer you gaze at these underwater streets, the more you feel the pull of the place, beckoning you to dive deeper. Sometimes archaeologists find personal items here, amulets, vessels, jewelry. These small objects are especially touching. They remind us of the people who lived, worked, loved, and prayed here, completely unaware that their city would one day disappear underwater. Holding a photo of an amulet in your hands, you realize it has lain in the darkness for centuries, survived the passage of time, and all this time silently preserved the story of its owner. As the boat returns to shore, a quiet sense of melancholy lingers. Thonis Herakleion isn't destroyed in the traditional sense. It's simply gone, as if a vast living organism had slowly sunk into slumber, leaving behind a still surface of water. And you realize, this mystery will long raise questions. How did a city of such magnitude disappear? Why do the traces of destruction look so neat? And what else lies hidden beneath the stone streets, unseen for millennia? Dungeons of the Temple of Dendera. When you first enter the Dendera temple complex, your attention is immediately drawn to the vibrant reliefs and grandeur of the main hall. But the real secret lies not above, but beneath the stone. Within the temple, there is a network of narrow underground corridors, so cramped and low that at times one must crawl, and it is these closed dark passages that raise the deepest questions about their purpose and function. The walls of the corridors are covered with unusual images. Many of them are difficult to understand at first glance. Scenes related to rites of rebirth, symbols of light, and secret processions within the temple. Some images appear as if they were intended for a privileged few, only those who knew the hidden meaning. Standing inside such a passage, you feel the stone walls pressing down on your shoulders, forcing you to think not of architecture, but of something secret and significant taking place here. One of the most discussed images is a scene of priests holding an object resembling an elongated glass form. Scholars explain it as a symbol of the birth of light. However, many past researchers have attempted to interpret it differently, making the Dendera corridors particularly popular among mystery lovers. But standing next to these reliefs, you realize there is no secret technology here. There is only a profound ritual language that the ancient Egyptians used to convey the connection between light, life, and the movement of the sun. What's particularly impressive is how hidden these corridors are. To get inside, you need to pass through a discreet door or descend a narrow shaft. It seems the builders deliberately concealed them, creating a route known only to initiates. These passages were not intended for ordinary temple visitors. They are unadorned and serve no purpose for the general public. Everything suggests that rituals were performed here, rituals significant only to priests of a certain rank. The humid air inside the corridors makes you feel their age. You run your hand along the wall and feel the cool stone, bearing the traces of people who walked here shortly before the Common Era. The silence is so thick that it seems to listen to your breathing. At moments like these, you understand why ancient temples inspired both respect and fear. The underground part of Dendera seems alive, breathing, imbued with invisible layers of the past. Deep in the dungeons, small chambers were discovered where priests stored sacred objects and prepared for nightly rituals. Remains of vessels and candles used in rituals associated with the goddess Hathor were found here. These rooms are surprisingly modest, yet seem far more significant than the richly decorated halls above. Here, in this cramped stone space, occurred what defined the temple's spiritual essence. One of the strangest features of the dungeons is their layout. The corridors don't form a simple straight line. They curve, rise, and fall, as if replicating some symbolic path. Some scholars believe the structure of the dungeons represents the ritual journey of the sun through the invisible world. As you walk through these passages, you can't help but feel that every step and turn has a meaning, revealed only to the inner circle of priests. Sometimes you hear stories of even deeper levels beneath the temple, inaccessible to excavation due to the fragile structure. These rumors are unconfirmed, but the feeling of hidden depth never leaves. You walk along a narrow path illuminated by a lantern, and sense that beneath your feet there may be a space unknown to anyone. The silence of the dungeons seems to hint that the temple is merely a stepping stone to something more ancient. The walls of some chambers still retain traces of soot, making it appear as if a ritual had just been performed there. These dark marks create a strange contrast with the vibrant reliefs of the main hall. Below, everything is more raw, rough, and honest. It is precisely this contrast that makes the dungeons of Dendera so unsettling. You seem to see two grandiose sides of ancient religion: the celebratory and the hidden, the bright and the shadowed. When you finally emerge onto the surface, the harsh sunlight blinds you. The air becomes lighter, and the voices of tourists can be heard all around again. But inside, you still feel as if you've returned from a place not created for the ordinary eye. The dungeons of Dendera are more than just corridors beneath a temple. This is where ancient priests hid their most important work, concealing it from those who saw only its superficial beauty. And much in these passages remains a mystery, something that can only be felt, not explained. Astronomical Circle Nabta Playa. When you first find yourself among the stone structures of Nabta Playa, it's hard to believe that these inconspicuous circles and standing stones once played a significant role in the lives of ancient people. They look like simple groups of boulders scattered in the desert. But the longer you look, the more you sense that these locations weren't chosen at random. There's an order to their arrangement that draws your gaze and compels you to search for hidden meaning in this endless silence. Nabta Playa is located deep in the desert, making it difficult to reach. The wind blows sand across the plain, and the sun makes the air almost still. Everything around seems motionless, as if space itself has frozen. However, it is precisely in this environment that the stone circle functions as a precision instrument. The sun's shadows, the horizon, and the positions of the stars become more apparent. The ancient inhabitants who lived here long before the first Egyptian kings seem to have used these natural conditions to observe the sky with incredible attention. The main mystery of Nabta Playa is the precise placement of the stones. Some are positioned so that on the summer solstice, the sun rises precisely between certain boulders. Others indicate the direction of sunset on specific days of the year. Standing before these stones, you realize you're looking at more than just the remains of an ancient nomadic camp. This is a calendar created by people who might not have mastered writing, but who had a keen understanding of the movements of the celestial bodies. The circle's age is particularly impressive. It dates back to a time before monumental Egyptian architecture, when people lived in primitive communities but were already trying to record important natural cycles. All this suggests that knowledge of the sky arose among the valley's inhabitants much earlier than previously thought. You begin to understand that Nabta Playa is key to understanding the formation of the culture that would later give rise to pyramids, temples, and a complex system of religious beliefs. Among the stones are vertical slabs arranged in straight lines. They seem to direct the gaze to specific parts of the horizon. Some scientists believe these lines may have been used to observe the stars, which played an important role in determining the timing of rains and migrations. Ancient people depended on nature, and understanding its cycles was a matter of survival. Standing among these stones, you sense that this was not just a matter of scientific endeavor, but a matter of everyday life. There are also more difficult to explain elements, groups of stones arranged in complex geometric shapes that don't fit into conventional solar observation patterns. These structures could represent cosmic phenomena associated with the movements of certain stars. Some researchers have suggested that the circle reflects knowledge of the most important parts of the sky, which later became the basis for the Egyptian priestly calendar. Although evidence is scant, the idea itself suggests that the ancient inhabitants of Nabta Playa possessed far more profound knowledge than is commonly believed. Standing in the center of the circle, a strange sense of clarity arises. The sun moves across the sky slowly and smoothly, and the shadows of the stones grow longer. They seem to come alive, revealing directions that the average eye would easily miss. You understand that every movement of light here had significance. Perhaps here they observed the first sunrise after a long drought, or determined the beginning of the rainy season. All this created a special connection between people and the sky, one that modern humans have almost lost. One of the most discussed aspects of the complex is the large stone slabs that once stood upright. Many of them now lie on the ground, but their shape and placement suggest they were important structural elements. Some studies have suggested that these slabs may have formed a kind of corridor through which sunlight passed on certain days. Standing near these massive boulders, one can't help but imagine how light glided across their surfaces thousands of years ago. It's sometimes said that Nabta Playa was not only an astronomical instrument, but also a site of sacred rites. People came here to mark important moments of the year, performing rituals related to fertility, rain, and the life cycle. This theory is hardly surprising. Observing the sky has always been associated with spirituality. Many ancient cultures perceived the cosmos as a world of gods and the movement of the stars as signs and prophecies. And standing here, in the silence of the desert, one can sense the power the ancients associated with the sky. It's also significant that the stone circle was built during a period when the climate in this area was milder. The desert looked different then. There were lakes and pastures, and people lived in small groups, hunting and gathering. But despite their simple lifestyle, they found the time and effort to create this complex. This suggests that observing nature was an important part of their culture. With the onset of drought and climate change, the people abandoned the area, leaving the circle as a silent reminder of a time when the desert was verdant. You walk away from the stones and turn around one last time. The wind raises thin waves of sand that glide between the stones, as if echoing the ancient movements of the celestial cycles. It seems as if the circle itself lives its own rhythmic life, continuing to mark the passing of time, even when no one watches its shadows. This is the greatest secret of Nabta Playa. It is a structure that has outlived its creators and continues to function, like an ancient but still functioning calendar. And when you finally turn away toward the desert, you're left with the feeling of having visited a place that didn't just show you the sky. It explained the world to people, helped them predict the future, and build lives in harmony with nature. And perhaps therein lies the answer to the mystery of Nabta Playa. Before you lies not just a circle of stones, but the first faint glow of a culture that would later create majestic temples and pyramids. Stone boxes of the Serapeum. Upon entering the Serapeum at Saqqara, the first impression is of entering a vast, cold dungeon, created not by humans, but by some silent stone. Dark tunnels lead off to the sides, disappearing into the depths. But the most powerful sensation arises when the gigantic stone boxes appear before your eyes. They stand in niches, like motionless sentries, and each one is so enormous that even several people could barely encircle it. These boxes were intended for the burial of sacred Apis bulls, animals considered the embodiment of divine power. But their size and precision astonish even experienced researchers. Each box is carved from a single block of stone, weighing tens of tons. The lids fit so perfectly that it's almost impossible to insert a blade between them and the body. You stand next to them and feel the geometry itself weighing on your consciousness. Too precise, too accurate. The most astonishing thing is the route these boxes must have taken to get here. The narrow corridors of the Serapeum seem too cramped to handle such enormous monoliths. This raises the question that many ask. How did the ancient craftsmen manage to transport them so deep into the underground galleries? Even with modern machinery, it would have been extremely difficult. Imagine the workers pulling the multi-ton blocks by torchlight, lowering them step by step, lower and lower. This thought evokes the incredible power of the labor that went into creating the necropolis. Some of the surfaces of the boxes are polished to an almost mirror-like shine. This creates a strange impression. It seems as if the inner chambers were built for some ritual that required perfect smoothness. Archaeologists attribute this to reverence for sacred animals and the special status of the apis. But when you look at the reflective surface from dozens of meters of stone, you begin to wonder if there was something more to these procedures. Perhaps the smooth walls were used for ritual illumination, when priests lit oil lamps in deep niches. Interestingly, some of the boxes were empty. This has given rise to much speculation. Some believe the burials were looted in ancient times. Others suggest that some boxes served a symbolic purpose, perhaps representing images of future burials. Still, others suggest that the boxes may have been used in rites of passage, when animals that had not yet reached a certain status underwent special rites. Looking into an empty, dark box, it seems like a black entrance to the unknown. The silence in the dungeon is almost physically oppressive. Every sound echoes dully, and as you walk between the niches where these gigantic sarcophagi stand, you feel as if you're passing stone creatures watching your every step. The light from a lantern or lamp glides across the monolithic surfaces, and for a moment, it seems they're moving, catching the light. But this is only an illusion. In reality, everything here is motionless, as if time had stood still in the deep corridors. One of the most unusual details are the tool marks on some of the lids. They are almost uniform in depth and shape, as if machine-made. Scientists attribute this to the skill of the stonemasons and the careful organization of the work. But when you stand before a perfectly flat surface, across which you can draw a line without it deviating even a millimeter, it's hard to resist the feeling that the ancients knew more about stone than we realize. Sometimes archaeologists find small objects in the Serapeum, pieces of fabric, remains of wooden structures, fragments of rope. These small items serve as a reminder of the hard work of the people who created the underground necropolis. Every detail here is not just labor, but part of a vast ritual world in which sacred animals played a key role. It's as if you imagine priests carefully leading a bull through a hallway lit by fires, preparing for the ritual that was to link the worlds of man and the gods. The very sense of space in the Serapeum is different. The corridors are narrow, but wide in height. The walls seem to press down from above, yet leave enough space to feel part of this ancient path. The air is cool, and it seems to waft with the scent of oil and resin used to coat animals before burial. The mind seems to reconstruct the details of rituals long forgotten, yet which left their traces in stone. One of the most disturbing moments is the realization that only part of the Serapeum has been thoroughly explored. Some corridors remain sealed, others are filled with collapsed rock. You realize that the dungeon may conceal even more boxes, chambers, and ritual halls. And perhaps therein lie the answers to questions that have been asked for centuries. But time and the earth guard their secrets tightly, as if unwilling to let them out. As you climb back toward the light, your gaze involuntarily lingers on the cave entrance. A cool current of air wafts from it, as if the dungeon is exhaling something ancient. You sense you've left behind not just the museum portion of the complex, but a place where time flows differently. The Serapeum doesn't reveal its secrets fully. It only hints at them, making you wonder why ancient peoples expended so much effort creating perfectly carved stone boxes deep within the earth. And you realize, the longer you study the Serapeum, the less certain you become. Everything here is crafted with incredible precision, unsettling symmetry, and incomprehensible tenacity. This is more than just a necropolis of sacred animals. It is a monument that enshrines that part of Egyptian belief that concerned transition, power, and connection with the invisible world. And even after many centuries, these stone boxes continue to hold their quiet, heavy secret. Temple complex of Qom el-Hamad. Arriving in Qom el-Hamad, your first impression is of a place almost unknown. It's hidden among fields and small villages, and the very feel of the journey seems to reflect its nature. The closer you get, the more it seems as if these ruins conceal something forgotten. Before you are fragments of columns, massive blocks, the remains of buildings that seem to have sunk into the earth, trying to hide the traces of their past. But the closer you look, the clearer it becomes that this place isn't simply ruined. It's strange, as if created by a different logic. The greatest mystery of the complex lies in its structure. The ruins appear to have once housed a temple, one that must have rivaled other known centers in scale, yet no detailed records of it survive. How could a temple be so significant yet almost disappear from the historical record? The stone blocks are scattered as if they were rearranged or concealed underground. And when you look at these remains, you begin to realize that the complex was much larger than it appears at first glance. Some areas are covered with slabs resembling the ceilings of underground chambers, but attempts to explore them were often thwarted by the fragile soil and the high risk of collapse. This gave rise to numerous rumors of hidden levels that could have housed ritual objects or priestly archives. Standing next to such a slab, you feel the space breathe. A silence beneath your feet evokes the emptiness deep beneath the surface. You want to listen, as if the echo of the footsteps of those who walked here thousands of years ago still lingers. The column fragments are particularly striking. Their surfaces are decorated with carvings that differ from the typical ornamentation found on large Egyptian temples. They feature symbols associated with local cults and images that are not always easy to identify. Some scholars have suggested that the temple was dedicated to several deities at once, while others believe the complex served as a transitional center between different religious traditions. Looking at the columns, you realize that their designs conceal an attempt to unite the various aspects of a faith that was once vibrant and fluid. The remains of ancient buildings here seem to tell of stages of reconstruction. Some walls are lined with large blocks, others with smaller ones. Some columns stand on massive foundations, while others appear to have been added later, as if they were additions. It all resembles a temple that has constantly changed, adapted, and survived through different eras. But these changes don't appear chaotic. They create a strange composition that seems logical only to those who knew the meaning of the rituals that took place here. One of the most enigmatic elements of the complex are the narrow passages leading to small, unadorned chambers. These rooms are surprisingly modest, but their layout creates the impression that they were intended for special purposes. Perhaps they served as places for priests to prepare for rituals, or perhaps as storage areas for objects accessible only to a select few. When you enter such a room, the air becomes quieter, as if the walls are holding the remnants of an ancient prayer within. You sense that the place is small, yet significant. Fragments of inscribed slabs are also interesting. Many retain only a few symbols, but even these hint at a complex system of priestly titles and rituals. Some inscriptions are difficult to identify, as if they belong to a special spiritual school that was not widely disseminated. Such finds create the impression that the complex served not only as a temple, but also as a center of learning. Priests could gather here, undergo initiation, and study ritual formulas. Looking at the small, barely noticeable symbols, you realize that behind them stood people whose work was almost hidden from society. The complex's location creates a particularly striking impression. It's not built on a high site, like many temples, but in a lowland. This seems unusual. The ancient Egyptians often sought elevated positions to emphasize the temple's connection to the sky. But here, it's the opposite. Perhaps this temple was associated with subterranean forces or with waters, which played an important role in local rituals. You sense that the landscape here is not random, as if the ancient masters were trying to emphasize not grandeur, but depth, a connection to the earth, to what lies beneath the surface. There's also a strange sense that part of the complex was deliberately destroyed, the marks of blows on the columns and fragments of statues scattered as if dropped from a height hint at a period of decline, or that the temple became the target of a struggle between various groups. What exactly happened here remains unclear, but the pattern of destruction itself looks less like the work of time and more like the marks of human hands seeking to erase everything associated with this place. And you begin to wonder, what could have provoked such fury? As you leave the complex, your gaze involuntarily lingers on its edges. The stones seem to continue to whisper of what they have witnessed. You realize that before you is an unseen, almost forgotten part of Egyptian history, a place that remains silent yet never disappears. The Qam el-Hammad temple complex is a mystery not because it contains impossible structures, but because it conceals its past in simple yet incomprehensible traces. And the more closely you look, the more you sense that this temple is one of those still waiting for its moment to reveal its true identity. The death of Cambisi's army. The story of the destruction of Cambisi's army always sounds as if it were told not by historians, but by witnesses to some ancient tragedy no one was supposed to know about. You imagine a vast army sent into the desert to conquer a distant oasis, And you realize we're not talking about dozens or hundreds of warriors. According to old accounts, the campaign was so vast that traces of the army should have remained visible for centuries. But the desert claimed them with alarming ease. According to an ancient account, the army was heading for the Siwa Oasis, home to a sanctuary revered by many rulers. Cambyses, eager to assert his power, ordered his men to cross the desert, despite warnings of the difficult journey. But what happened next has become one of the darkest mysteries of the Egyptian deserts. At some point, the army simply vanished, as if wiped off the face of the earth. You stand amid the sands and try to imagine thousands of people vanishing without a trace. Travelers and locals alike reported strange phenomena in those parts. Some spoke of sudden storms that arose so quickly that people had no time to seek shelter. Others claimed to have seen distant silhouettes disappearing into the haze. These stories reinforce the sense that the desert is not just a place, but a force capable of consuming everything. You look at the sands and realize that they truly can hide the traces of any tragic event, especially one of such magnitude. Many researchers tried to find traces of the army. Expeditions were conducted, suspected routes were studied, but still the desert remained silent. Occasionally, fragments of pottery, pieces of metal, and human bones were found, but not a single find provided a precise understanding of what happened. There were too few clues to solve such a great mystery. You sense how space itself protects its history, preventing researchers from reconstructing the events. One of the most realistic theories was that the army perished in a sandstorm. Desert storms are truly dangerous here. The wind whips up sand so high that it seems the sky disappears. In such a storm, it's easy to lose track of your route, your men, and even entire units. But something about this explanation seems too simple. You try to imagine a huge army vanishing completely. Even if the storm were incredibly powerful, the remains of people and animals should have remained. But the desert left almost nothing. There are other theories. Some believe the army may have lost its way and traveled much further than planned. Perhaps the warriors reached places where the water ran out too quickly, and people began to perish one after another. The desert is merciless, especially when travelers are unfamiliar with its peculiarities. But even this theory doesn't explain the complete disappearance of the tracks. It's as if you see before you a multitude of small tragedies merging into one vast trace, erased by time. Sometimes archaeologists find traces of campsites, coals from fires, broken vessels. These finds give hope that one day a large army's death site will be discovered. But the desert is constantly changing. The shifting sands can conceal entire cities, much less human traces. You realize that every find here could be a chance one-off, and beyond it lie kilometers of emptiness that could hide anything. There are also legends that add further depth to the mystery. Some say Cambyses' army was punished by the gods for approaching the sacred site without due respect. Others believe the army fell into a trap set by locals who knew the desert better. But all these legends merely underscore the main point. No one knows exactly what happened. The desert has appropriated this knowledge as if considering it part of its power. It's also surprising that traces of the army's possible demise could be hidden several meters beneath the sand. Scientists sometimes find animal skeletons buried under layers of sand that are centuries old. And you understand, if the army was truly buried by a storm, the traces could lie so deep that they would be almost impossible to discover without chance. The desert has become a vast stone book, its pages closed to those who arrived too late. Some expeditions used modern equipment to search for anomalies beneath the sand. They found structures resembling clusters of stones, perhaps camps. But every attempt to get closer ended the same. The tracks were scattered and incomplete. It was as if a powerful force had taken everything connected to that expedition and scattered them across the desert in all directions. You realize that time is working against the explorers. Every year, the sands do their work, and the chances of finding tracks diminish. The most unsettling feeling comes when you realize the desert offers no answers, yet it feels as if it knows them. You stand on a spot where thousands of people may have once walked, and all you see around you are endless waves of sand. They are quiet, almost gentle, but behind this calm lies a force that destroyed an entire army. The story of Cambyses reminds us how fragile even the most grandiose plans can be in the face of nature. Walking away from these places leaves you with the feeling of having left behind a vast secret that lives on in the desert. The destruction of Cambyses' army is more than just a historical mystery. It's a story of how one misstep can lead to the disappearance of something seemingly indestructible. And as long as the desert remains silent, this mystery will live on, inspiring both respect and apprehension in all who attempt to touch its edge. Sanctuaries of Oasis Siwa. When you first arrive at the Siwa Oasis, you feel as if you've entered a place apart from all of Egypt. This isn't just an oasis in the sand, it's a world where silence speaks louder than voices, and ancient buildings appear to continue their secret work despite the passing of millennia. It was here that the sanctuaries were located, attracting rulers, travelers, and priests from across the ancient world, leaving behind traces that are difficult to understand but impossible to ignore. The oasis is surrounded by hills, sand ridges, and natural walls that protected it from the outside world. And when you enter the center of Siwa, you sense that the ancient masters chose the sites for their sacred buildings deliberately. One of the main sanctuaries is the temple dedicated to the god Amun. It is called the Temple of the Oracle because rulers came here for answers to questions that determined the fate of their countries. Standing before the ruins, you realize how powerful this place was in ancient times. The temple is built on a cliff, where the steep rise of the land creates the feeling that nature itself is emphasizing its significance. Only partial walls remain, but even their fragments suggest the temple's importance. Inside, there are remains of chambers where priests lived, as well as a small chamber that many consider a center for divination. You step inside and feel the space shrink, leaving only a narrow beam of light filtering through the cracks. It seems as if this place was created for a voice, meant to be quiet yet penetrating. The most enigmatic thing about the Siwa shrines is that they bear little resemblance to traditional Egyptian temples. Local craftsmen used clay, stone, and straw, creating buildings that seem to emerge from the earth. This makes them less monumental, but far more alive. They seem to continue to breathe with the hot air of the oasis. Looking at the walls, which bear the fingerprints of the people who sculpted them thousands of years ago, you realize that before you is not cold architecture, but the result of a very personal work. But the most compelling aspect is the oracle's role. It wasn't just locals who came here for advice. Envoys from rulers came here, and once Alexander the Great himself, seeking words about his destiny. While the precise details of the visit have long since faded into legend, the very idea that an ancient hero sought advice in this small temple in the desert heightens the sense that something special was taking place here. You imagine the king ascending the narrow path, while the priests prepare a ritual that would yield an answer that would change history. The interior of the temple is unlike the large halls we're accustomed to. Everything here is more modest, more intimate, more private. It seems as if the temple was designed not for large ceremonies, but for quiet, intimate rituals. The rooms are designed so that almost no light penetrates. Silence becomes the primary element. You feel that every step, every touch on the wall, carries a meaning that cannot be expressed in words. In such places, the mind seems to attune itself to the ritual. Besides the main temple, there were other sanctuaries in Siwa. One of them is located in the so-called City of Death, a huge hill dotted with tombs. As you climb, you can smell the wind carrying sand and the scent of dry grass. Some tombs are well preserved, others have almost disappeared, but the very structure of the hill creates the impression of a vast staircase between two worlds. Paintings have been found here, simple yet profound. They tell of the soul's journey, of passing through gates, of a transition that for the people of Siwa was not just a matter of faith, but a part of life. There's also a shrine, rarely discussed, but particularly disturbing. It's a small temple, hidden in the shadow of a rock formation. It's often mistaken for an ordinary room, but inside, symbols unique to this site have been preserved. Some depict figures resembling people standing in prayer or reaching out to heaven. Others display strange combinations of lines, suggesting an attempt to convey the invisible. Scholars don't fully understand the meaning of these symbols, but when you look at them, you sense that they're not ritualistic. They're personal. The Siwa Oasis is a place many considered the edge of the world. On one side is a vast desert, on the other, small fields, springs of water, and silence. Here, it seemed as if the earth and sky were closer together than anywhere else. And the people of Siwa have preserved their traditions for centuries, refusing to allow outside forces to change them. Even today, standing among the ruins of the sanctuaries, you sense that the place has not lost its energy. It remains as it was when those who came here in moments of despair or hope saw it. It's also interesting that many of the paths leading to the sanctuaries pass by water springs. These springs were considered sacred. The water here is cold and surprisingly clear, as if protected by the very walls of the oasis. Locals say that some springs never dry up, even in the hottest years. This adds to the mystique. Water in the desert has always been perceived as a sign of divine presence. You lean over the water and see your reflection, sharp, as if it were a mirror in which details disappear, leaving only a glance. Standing on the top of one of the hills, you notice how small paths connect the shrines. They seem random, but if you look long enough, you can see a certain logic. Perhaps these paths were used during ritual processions. Perhaps priests walked from one temple to another, following the light of torches or the movement of the stars. Locals told legends of nightly ceremonies when fires moved across the hills, leaving trails of light. And you sense that these stories are not just fiction. In such silence, it's easy to believe in the power of light. When you leave the Siwa sanctuaries, you're left with the feeling that the place won't let you go. It seems to watch your every step, but not with hostility, rather with curiosity. The Siwa Oasis is more than just a historical site. It's a living memory of those who knew how to hear the silence, look at the stars, and see answers in them. Here, among the rocks and sands, you can feel a connection with those who believed that God spoke through light, wind, and water. And this feeling lingers with you long afterward, as if the sanctuary continues to whisper something even when you're far away. The missing royal mummies. When you first hear the expression missing royal mummies, it sounds like an exaggeration. It seems incredible that the remains of rulers whose names were revered for centuries could vanish without a trace. But Egyptian history, especially in its later periods, is replete with events that left traces of destruction, displacement, and chaos. And it is precisely among these events that one of the most disturbing mysteries lies: the fate of the mummies of great kings who simply vanished from their tombs. The Valley of the Kings contained numerous tombs, each carefully protected. The Egyptians believed the body was the key to eternal life, and therefore did everything possible to preserve it intact. But despite a complex system of traps, hidden passages, and deceptions, the tombs were repeatedly looted, and some mummies disappeared so long ago that archaeologists still cannot determine who they belonged to, or where they might have been moved. The problem is compounded by the fact that many of the burials were opened in ancient times. These were not rare occurrences. Royal tombs were looted regularly, especially during times of crisis. Imagine nightly squads of robbers descending through secret entrances and carrying away anything of any value. Sometimes they even took mummies, thinking jewelry might be hidden under their bandages. And even if mummies were found later, it was far from always possible to determine where they had once rested. One of the most mysterious is the fate of the mummy of Cheops. Everyone knows about the tomb's existence, but the king's body has never been found. For a long time, it was believed that it was destroyed by robbers, but some researchers speculate that the mummy may have been moved by priests to a safer location to protect it from decay. You imagine a quiet nighttime procession of priests carefully carrying the sacred body through narrow corridors and hiding it deep within the rocks. But if so, why are there no traces of this operation? Another example is the mummies of some kings of the New Kingdom. When the priests realized that protecting the tombs in the Valley of the Kings was becoming nearly impossible, they began transferring the bodies to secret collective repositories. One such repository was discovered in the late 19th century. Dozens of pharaohs were found there, but by no means all of them. Some mummies were missing, despite documentary mentions. They should have been transferred along with the others, but they were not. This means they were either hidden separately or had already been lost. The fate of the mummies of female rulers is particularly interesting. Nefertiti's tomb has never been found, and her mummy remains a legend. Some believe her body may be in a hidden section of the famous tomb, which has not yet been explored due to the fragility of the walls. Others suggest she was buried separately to avoid attempts to erase her memory. Reading these theories, one senses the mystery growing. Too much remains unknown, too few clues to point the way. No less mysterious is the story of several mummies discovered without names. In some caches, bodies were discovered, carefully bandaged and preserved, but without inscriptions. Even experienced Egyptologists couldn't identify them. They belonged to someone important, but why their names were erased is unknown. You look at photographs of such mummies and realize that before you are people whose destinies were important to their era, and now they lie in museums as Anonymous royal mummies. There is nothing more frightening than a name vanished from history. There's also a political component. During times of unrest between priests and rulers, attempts to erase the memory of previous pharaohs were common. Sometimes statues were destroyed, sometimes names were carved from monuments. And if this happened to images, it's easy to imagine what might have been done to the mummies themselves. Perhaps some were deliberately destroyed, not for the sake of wealth, but to erase power and legacy. Such actions are almost impossible to trace, which makes the mystery even more disturbing. Occasionally, reports emerge of private collectors possessing ancient remains whose provenance raises questions. These cases are rare and almost always unconfirmed, but the very idea that a royal mummy could have ended up in the hands of an unknown person is frightening. Mummies were always traded in ancient times, and some may have traveled far, leaving Egypt forever. Where to? There's no answer. But the thought haunts. Perhaps a mummy is now lying in a private collection, its identity unknown. One of the strangest things is that sarcophagi without bodies have been found in some tombs. They were fully prepared for burial, decorated and sealed, but inside, they were empty. Scientists speculate that the mummies may have been removed by ancient priests during times of crisis. But where? Why did no one leave any records? You stand before such a sarcophagus in a museum and feel as if it were asking, "Where is the one to whom I belonged?" And no one can answer. Modern technology helps us better understand the origins of mummies. Tissue, bone, and resin analysis can determine their age, and sometimes even their name. But this is a slow process that doesn't always yield results. Sometimes a mummy remains nameless even after all the research. And in moments like these, you realize that time truly can hide the truth. Leaving a museum or tomb where mummies are kept is a strange feeling. You realize that before you lies more than just an archaeological mystery. These are the destinies of people who believed themselves eternal, people who built monuments, confident that no one could disturb their peace. And yet, they vanished. The missing royal mummies are a reminder of how easily history can fade, leaving behind an empty sarcophagus and a nameless body hidden somewhere deep underground. The empty tomb of Cheops. When you first enter the Great Pyramid, you feel as if you're stepping into a boundary between worlds. The cool air of the corridors, the low passages, the scent of stone that has preserved the silence of millennia, all this creates the sense that the pyramid was built not simply as a tomb, but as a place where space itself obeys a strange, invisible logic. But the main shock comes not from the structure's size, but from the fact that the king's body was never found inside. The tomb of Khufu is considered one of the greatest human-made monuments. However, the sarcophagus in the so-called king's chamber was empty. There was no mummy, no funerary objects, no hint of the ritual implements that always accompanied the body of a ruler in ancient Egypt. You peer at the smooth walls of the chamber, trying to imagine what the room must have looked like when it was first opened, and you realize no one knows what it must have looked like. Another theory suggests that Cheops wasn't originally buried in the pyramid, that the pyramid was merely a symbol, and his real resting place was elsewhere, perhaps well hidden. You imagine priests conducting a secret burial ceremony far from the main monument, leaving the pyramid as a mere symbol of power and transition. But this theory, too, is unproven. No alternative tomb for Cheops has ever been found. The sarcophagus attracts particular attention. It's too large to be removed from the chamber and too heavy to be lifted after its construction. This means it was placed inside before the chamber was sealed. But if the sarcophagus was placed there beforehand, why wasn't the body placed inside? Or, if it was, where did it disappear to? You look at the sarcophagus and realize it's part of the mystery. Its rough workmanship is unlike the exquisite sarcophagi of other kings. It seems functional, not decorative. There are also suggestions that the pyramid may have contained hidden passages leading to other rooms. Researchers have studied the pyramid using new technologies: scanning, infrared analysis, and temperature measurements. Several voids have been discovered, located above and to the sides of the known corridors. They are too regular, too smooth to be random. It seems that another space, inaccessible to researchers, may exist within the pyramid, a place where the true sarcophagus of Cheops may once have been located. One of the most disturbing questions is why there's not a single trace of a completed ritual in the pyramid. Other tombs contain remnants of objects, fragments of fabric, resin, and symbolic images. Here, there's emptiness. The silence is so thick that it seems as if the walls are deliberately devoid of decoration. You look at the smooth surfaces and sense that this lack of decoration is also a message. It's as if the pyramid was created for the very idea of eternity, not for a specific body. Some scholars believe the Great Pyramid may have been built not only as a tomb, but also as a gigantic symbolic structure, a device associated with the idea of passage, ascent, or observation of the movements of the sky. And the Great Chamber may have served as a sacred center, where rituals unrelated to burial took place. You stand in the middle of an empty room and think, perhaps the pharaoh's body was not needed here at all, because the pyramid itself is his symbolic shell. But there are also those who suggest that the body was indeed here, that it was inside the sarcophagus, but was destroyed by robbers in ancient times. However, this theory is also weak. Robbers usually leave at least some trace: bones, bandages, the remains of amulets. Nothing was found in the king's chamber. Completely erasing the presence of a body is virtually impossible. And this makes one wonder, perhaps the mummy was never inside the sarcophagus? The strangest thing is that not a single object was found nearby. The ancient Egyptians believed that the deceased needed objects to overcome the spirit world, but there is nothing of the sort in the tomb of Cheops. You understand that this contradicts the very essence of Egyptian faith. How could the ruler who erected the largest monument be buried without the traditional set of objects? This seems not just strange, but unnatural for that era. Some researchers have suggested that the pyramid was built as a temple, not a tomb. In this interpretation, the empty chamber is not a mistake, but part of the design. The absence of the mummy then becomes a semantic element. The chamber was intended for rituals associated with light, the stars, or divine principles. Perhaps ceremonies related to the daily and nightly movements of the sun were held here. Perhaps this was the center where the king was symbolically resurrected, while his actual body was kept elsewhere. But no matter how many theories there are, no one knows the truth. You stand in the center of the king's chamber and feel a silence that is unlike any other. It is denser, heavier, as if filled with hidden meaning. And it is this silence that makes you realize that the mummy's absence is more than just an archaeological mystery. It is a reminder that even the greatest structures can harbor emptiness, leaving only hints and traces that will never form a complete picture. As you ascend back into daylight, a sense of strangeness lingers. The Great Pyramid is a monument that has outlived a king, an era, and civilizations. But what it has preserved most is not a body, but a mystery. The empty tomb of Cheops is like an answer no one can hear. It is silent, and precisely in this silence lies its greatest mystery. Nefertiti's tomb has not been found. When people think of Nefertiti, their minds immediately conjure up her famous portrait, a graceful profile, frozen in calm confidence. But behind this familiar image lies one of Egypt's deepest mysteries: the place where she was buried. You read about her, look at her statues, imagine the era of change she lived through, and you realize the disappearance of her tomb isn't just strange, it's as if it were deliberately hidden, a figure too influential, a trace too visible, and yet completely silent underground. For the ancient Egyptians, the role of the pharaoh's wife was almost as significant as that of the ruler himself. And Nefertiti, judging by surviving evidence, was more than just a queen. She participated in religious reforms, stood by Akhenaten's side when he attempted to change the foundations of the faith, supported the cult of the solar disk, and perhaps even ruled independently. And yet, her tomb has not been found in any known necropolis. This is astonishing, as queens of such stature were almost always buried in opulent tombs, carefully protected from enemies and time. Some researchers suggest that Nefertiti may have been buried in Amarna, the capital built by Akhenaten. This capital of the sun god's worship didn't last long. After the king's death, it was abandoned and then practically razed to the ground. During the city's destruction, many burials were plundered, some filled in, and others completely destroyed. Perhaps Nefertiti's tomb was located in an area razed to the ground by later builders. But even if this is true, why has no mention of it survived? Not a single sign, even indirect. Another theory is that Nefertiti's tomb is located in the Valley of the Kings. The site of many rulers' final resting places seems a natural choice for hers. But this raises another mystery. If she was indeed buried alongside the great kings, then where is the entrance? Some believe her burial is in a hidden chamber, located next to the famous tomb. perhaps just behind the wall of the site where Tutankhamun was found. Studies using infrared sensors even hinted at possible voids, but excavations were halted due to the risk of damaging the unique paintings. You imagine this moment, a gallery, walls covered in vibrant images, the silence of eavesdropping centuries, and beyond the wall, perhaps another room, lost, inaccessible, unseen by anyone since the ancient priests. The thought sends shivers down your spine. If that really is Nefertiti's tomb, then we stand just steps away from one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time, and we can't get a meter closer. Many aspects of Nefertiti's story raise questions. Her life is poorly documented despite the power she wielded. After a certain year, her name disappears from inscriptions. It's as if she vanished. Some believe there may have been attempts to erase her from history for her involvement in religious reforms. In such cases, statues were destroyed, names were removed, and images were removed. And if so, perhaps she was buried secretly, without pomp, away from the eyes of those who wanted to declare the old faith the only true one. There's a more daring theory that Nefertiti reigned as a queen under a different name. She could have been buried as a pharaoh, in a separate closed tomb, but with all identification removed. Then the search would have to be entirely different. You needn't just look for a name, you need to look for a burial befitting a person of high status, but without a signature. You look at the list of anonymous mummies and tombs and realize that such a possibility exists. Perhaps Nefertiti's body has already been found. It's just that no one knows it's hers. When you look at a map of the Valley of the Kings, you're struck by the number of undiscovered areas. Many side gorges conceal layers of stone that haven't been touched since ancient times. Some sites are so dangerous to excavate that they can't be explored without risking collapse. And you realize that a tomb could be right nearby, hidden beneath a rock layer that can't be moved. The valley's silence isn't just natural, it's a silence that conceals more than it reveals. Sometimes archaeologists find small objects that could hint at Nefertiti's presence, fragments of amulets, pieces of pottery, remnants of paintings. But each time, the connection to the queen turns out to be too weak, too indirect. Sand and time have mixed everything so thoroughly that it's almost impossible to separate one from the other. You look at these tiny fragments and feel despair, as if trying to assemble a vessel from grains of sand. One of the strangest aspects of the search is that many ancient documents make no mention of her death. This is especially unusual given her status. The deaths of such people were always accompanied by rituals and inscriptions. But here, there's silence. As if her passing was hidden, a secret known only to a select few. Perhaps her death was politically dangerous. Perhaps it was too controversial. In any case, the lack of mention seems not just odd, but a clue. If it wasn't written down, it was hidden. And this is precisely what makes the mystery of Nefertiti's tomb so enduring. It's not simply historical, it's personal. It contains elements of loss, struggle, hidden influence, and the dream of a discovery that will change our perspective on an entire era. Until the tomb is found, Nefertiti's story remains unfinished. She stands on the border between the known and the unknown, like a shadow glimpsed only out of the corner of our eye. When you step away from the Valley of the Kings or Amarna, where her tomb may once have been hidden, you feel as if you're leaving a place that still lives its own secret life. The mystery of Nefertiti isn't just a matter of archaeology. It's a sense that great people can vanish, the way sunlight fades beyond the horizon, quietly, but in such a way that no one can tell where exactly night fell. Erosion and Age of the Sphinx. Standing before the Great Sphinx, it's hard to shake the feeling that it's looking not only at the horizon, but through time. Its face is worn by wind and sand, its body partially buried beneath layers of desert, and the traces of destruction are like wounds inflicted not by nature, but by history itself. And it's these traces, these strange lines of erosion, that have led to one of Egypt's most enduring and contentious mysteries. Just how ancient is the Sphinx? Walking around the monument from behind, it becomes apparent that its structure has been damaged differently than most of Giza's structures. Deep vertical grooves, as if left by water, cross the walls of the depression in which it stands. These marks don't resemble the typical weathering caused by wind and sand. Instead, it feels as if water has been flowing over the stone over a long period of time, leaving soft, wavy lines. Running your hand over these marks, you realize such forms are difficult to explain by ordinary desert erosion. Some researchers have suggested that this erosion could only have occurred under conditions of heavy, prolonged rainfall. But the last periods of such rainfall in the Giza region date back to very ancient times, to times when the climate was humid and the desert had not yet become a desert. This raises a troubling question. If the marks on the Sphinx were left by water, was it really created much earlier than the time of the pharaohs? Much earlier than the pyramids? The official view is that the Sphinx was carved during the reign of King Khafra. This theory is based on the monument's location, similarities in style, and some indirect archaeological evidence. But when you stand next to the monument and see traces that are difficult to explain with ordinary logic, it becomes clear the Sphinx's age is not just a textbook date, but a question that raises doubts even among those with years of experience in archaeology. What's particularly odd is that the erosion is uneven. In some places it's deep, in others it's almost non-existent. This could be due to the varying quality of the stone, but when you look at the damage map, you see a pattern. The most severe erosion occurs in areas that were naturally vulnerable to water. Wind and sand don't create this pattern. You begin to think differently. Perhaps the Sphinx survived a time when it rained heavily on Giza, when the climate was different, when the world around it looked completely different. Some scholars associate these marks with the period when the Sahara was green. This time period belongs to an era difficult to imagine in the context of ancient Egypt. Prehistoric periods spanning thousands of years. If the Sphinx truly dates back to this period, then its creators lived long before the rise of known kingdoms. This is controversial because there is no direct archaeological evidence of such a culture, but there is also no explanation for the erosion's appearance. You look at the monument and feel the weight of this thought weighing on you. The Great Sphinx becomes more than just a statue, but a window into an era about which almost nothing is known. Its body seems to preserve the memory of the rain that fell thousands of years before the first pharaohs began to rule Egypt. Another theory is that the Sphinx was created earlier and then significantly reworked. The craftsman could have altered its face, renovated individual parts, or rebuilt the surrounding walls. If so, the original head could have been different, perhaps a lion's, or completely obliterated by time. In that case, traces of erosion could indeed have survived from an earlier era. You stand before the Sphinx and realize that the proportions of the head and body seem odd. The head is noticeably smaller than would be expected for a statue of such size. This creates a sense of incongruity. Equally significant is the fact that traces of restorations dating back to various periods, from ancient to modern, have been found near the Sphinx. Some blocks surrounding the monument were clearly laid later than the main part of the structure. This demonstrates how long ago people attempted to preserve the Sphinx. If restoration efforts were made as early as the first dynasties, then it must have already looked ancient. But this raises the question, how ancient was it, if even the ancients considered it ancient? The Sphinx's appearance is striking in that its face, even in its damaged state, demonstrates the incredible skill of the sculptors. But the body, especially the back, is more roughly crafted. This reinforces the theory that the builders could have been working on material that was already partially eroded. Looking at the contrast between the smooth surfaces of the head and the rough stones of the sides, you realize that the sculptors seem to be adapting to an existing form. Some researchers believe the Sphinx was connected to an ancient cult system that existed before the pyramids. It may have symbolized the guardian of the horizon, a sentinel between day and night, between the desert and the valley. In this interpretation, the monument's age becomes more than just a date, but part of a broader understanding of how ancient people understood the world. You sense that the Sphinx's gaze toward the sunrise is no coincidence. Its gaze is directed toward the beginning of the daily cycle, and if this symbol is older than we think, it changes the entire picture of Egyptian history. But the most troubling thing remains that there is no definitive answer. Every argument raises a new question. Every trace of erosion, a new hypothesis. Sand, wind, water, people, all have left their mark on the monument. But which one was first? When you look at the Sphinx in the sunset, its contours soften, its shadows lengthen, and it seems as if it's about to speak, quietly, incomprehensibly, in the language of time which belongs to no known era. The Sphinx seems to deliberately guard its secret, allowing you to come close, but not allowing you to touch the answers. You leave with the feeling that you've seen more than just a monument, but a being, something that has endured too much to reveal its story. And in this silence, in these strange lines on the stone, lies Giza's most poignant and most compelling mystery: unsolved pyramid texts. When you find yourself inside the Saqqara pyramids, especially those belonging to the early rulers, the familiar feeling of emptiness is replaced by something entirely different. The walls here are not smooth, as in later tombs. They are covered with columns of text, hundreds upon hundreds of lines, engraved with meticulous symbols. These are the oldest religious texts in Egypt, the first attempts by humans to record the soul's passage to the next world, and at the same time, they are some of the most difficult to decipher inscriptions that have survived to this day. These inscriptions are called the pyramid texts. They appeared before Egypt began actively decorating tombs with scenes and images. There are no familiar images of the afterlife, no dramatic scenes of judgment and rebirth, only words that were meant to act as keys to help the deceased navigate the world of darkness. But the more you read these lines, the more you realize these are not just prayers. This is a language created for those who knew what we have long forgotten. A significant portion of the texts are filled with formulas intended to protect, open the way, illuminate the darkness, or show the way. But the meaning of many phrases remains elusive even today. Sometimes one encounters expressions that sound almost like incantations, where each word could have several hidden meanings. You look at the lines etched in stone and sense that this is more than just a religion. It is an attempt to create instructions for passage into the invisible world, written in a language that no longer exists in living form. What's particularly strange is that some formulas are repeated from tomb to tomb, but with slight modifications. These variations create the impression that the priests were rewriting not just a text, but an idea. They seem to be improving it, strengthening it, or altering it in accordance with secret knowledge inaccessible to ordinary people. This approach makes the texts even more mysterious. If the priests themselves modified the formulas, it means they knew something about the afterlife that we don't. There's another peculiarity. Some lines contain the names not only of gods, but also of strange beings rarely mentioned in other sources. This creates the impression that the ancients believed in a more complex system of worlds than historians have imagined. You read about these beings and realized they weren't part of the familiar pantheon. They were associated with transition, with threats, with what the soul might encounter in the night. It's a map of dangers, created millennia ago, but still frightening in its accuracy. In the light of the lantern, the engravings become especially expressive. The symbols cast long shadows, as if whispering their own words. In some places, the hieroglyphs are etched so deeply that it seems as if the stone was carved with almost fury. Perhaps these were the most important formulas, those intended to protect the king at any cost. You run your fingers over these symbols and sense that they were not simply crafted by master craftsmen, they are imbued with conviction, almost fear. Sometimes there are gaps on the walls, places where text was intentionally removed or altered. These marks highlight the complexity of the text-making process. Perhaps priests adjusted formulas to align them with changing rituals, or they removed phrases whose meaning had lost its power over time. But such gaps on the walls always provoke anxiety. They remind us that there are words that cannot be spoken, or words that should be forgotten. Particularly striking are those sections where the texts serve not simply as prayers, but as descriptions of a specific path. There are phrases about starry roads, about the rising and setting of light, about how the soul becomes an eternal wanderer among the lights. These lines hint at ancient knowledge of the sky, which was part of rituals, not just observations. You understand that for the ancients, the world was one. Heaven, earth, and the afterlife were interconnected parts of a single, larger system. The pyramid texts are also astonishing in their number. You stand in a small chamber and see symbols literally everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, on the columns. This space is completely occupied by words. It's as if the priests were afraid to leave even a single unfilled surface, lest chaos creep in. The power of the tombs lies in this cramped text. Every surface became a prayer. With every line, they tried to keep the soul on the right track. Sometimes, when archaeologists discovered new fragments of texts, it took months to reconstruct their sequence. Phrases could be moved, fragments lost. And this process of reconstruction itself felt like deciphering an ancient cipher. You watch symbologists debate the meaning of a single sign, and you realize the pyramid texts are more than just ancient words. They are a riddle that resists understanding, as if guarding its secrets. Today, The pyramid texts are one of the most important sources of information about Egypt's early religious beliefs. But even after decades of research, a significant portion of them remains unclear. You leave a tomb, its walls covered in symbols, and feel as if you've touched something too ancient, too complex to fully comprehend. These texts are like the voice of a distant era, distorted but clear. They call but do not explain. And it is precisely this ambiguity that holds the deepest, most compelling mystery of the Saqqara pyramids. The disappearance of the Aten religion. When discussing the religion of Aten, it's impossible not to feel a strange tension. It was the first attempt in Egyptian history to create a cult centered around a single deity, the solar disk. Akhenaten, a ruler who dared to challenge millennia-old traditions, built a new capital, changed rituals, banned old cults, and forced the priests to worship only Aten. But the most astonishing thing about this story is how quickly and quietly everything vanished after his death. It was as if the religion had slipped through the fingers of an era, leaving only scraps, fragments, and shadows. Standing in the ruins of Amarna, the capital built for Aten, the silence is striking. It's not the kind of silence you might hear in ordinary ruins. Here, it seems to weigh heavily on your thoughts. Before your eyes are the faded remains of walls, traces of columns, fragments of bas-reliefs that depicted not gods with human faces, but rays of sunlight reaching out to people like living hands. You look at them and understand this was an attempt to create a new world system, one where the divine wasn't hidden behind complex images, but was present in the sunlight. But what happened after Akhenaten's death remains one of the most disturbing mysteries. The old priestly schools, deprived of power, were surely waiting for the moment to take revenge. But the disappearance of religion happened too quickly. It feels as if someone had prepared the ground in advance. All images of Aten were erased. Akhenaten's names were carved out. Buildings were destroyed. The entire city was left empty, as if cursed. You can imagine whole squads of priests going through the temples, methodically erasing all traces of the new faith. The main question is, what exactly was dangerous about the cult of Aten? Why was it necessary to erase it completely, as if it had never existed? Some believe that the religion of Aten undermined the power of the priests of the main temple of Amun. Others believe that its philosophy was too radical. Akhenaten taught that deity had no need of secrets and complex rituals, that sunlight was the very manifestation of divine power. You understand? Such an idea could have destroyed an entire social system based on mediation between people and gods. What's particularly strange is that many documents from the era were deliberately destroyed. Only fragments of hymns to Aten, found on the walls, remain. They are surprisingly poetic. They are full of light, sky, and images of the eternal warmth that enlivens the world. You read these lines and understand. This religion wasn't dark or dangerous. On the contrary, it was filled with a sense of renewal. So, why was it necessary to uproot it so thoroughly? There's a theory that the cult of Aten was tied to Akhenaten himself. He acted as the sole intermediary between God and people. If the ruler died, the structure lost its meaning. This could have made the religion unstable, but this theory only explains part of the story. After all, even unstable beliefs don't usually disappear instantly. They gradually dissolve. Here, however, the destruction was instantaneous, profound, and almost total. One of the most mysterious aspects is the fate of the Aten priests themselves. Where were they after the fall of Amarna? Why is there no surviving record of resistance? You imagine the city performing its final rituals, the priests gazing at the setting sun, knowing their time is running out. But where have they disappeared to? The silence is so thick that it seems as if they, along with their religion, have simply been erased. Even stranger is the fact that after Amarna's destruction, there are virtually no traces of a mass migration. The city emptied too quickly. It's as if people abandoned it in an instant. Some archaeological layers look as if the inhabitants left not in an orderly fashion, but in a rush. You see fragments of vessels, household items, traces of unfinished work. Everything speaks of suddenness, not just political, but almost emotional, as if Amarna had become a place that could not even be remembered. Sometimes fragments of paintings are found in ruins, depicting Akhenaten and Nefertiti beneath the rays of the sun disk. These fragments seem incredibly alive. They possess a warmth and light lacking in other Egyptian images. But these same fragments also show why the cult of Aten could be alarming. It elevated the ruler to near-divine status. This was not just an innovation, but a threat to the entire political structure of ancient Egypt. Many scholars believe that the primary goal of those who reintroduced the old cults was to restore order. But the scale of the destruction suggests not restoration, but fear, a desire to close the door forever. And the more one studies the lost capital, the stronger the sense that the fear was justified. The religion of Aten changed the world too abruptly. It may have threatened the very understanding of power and death, destroying the old bonds between man and God. What's particularly interesting is that some elements of the Aten cult did not disappear completely. They resurfaced in later texts, in architecture, even in religious imagery. The solar disk remained an important symbol, but official memory of the cult rituals disappeared. Everything associated with Aten seemed to have been relegated to the depths, to a realm of uncontrolled and ungovernable knowledge. Walking away from the ruins of Amarna leaves a strange feeling. The place seems to be watching you. It's quiet, but there's something unfinished in this silence. As if the religion of Aten hasn't disappeared, it's simply waiting. Not for people, not for worship, but for understanding. It stands between eras, like the sun's disk above the horizon, on the edge of light and shadow. And this is precisely what makes its disappearance one of Egypt's most terrifying and alluring mysteries. Tutankhamun's meteorite dagger. When the dagger lying at Tutankhamun's feet was first seen, no one imagined it would become one of Egypt's most enigmatic artifacts. It looked like a beautiful, masterfully crafted weapon. A slender blade, a gold hilt, and exquisite designs. Everything befitted the status of the young pharaoh. But when the metal was examined more closely, a story unfolded that still raises questions. It turned out the blade was made not of ordinary iron, but of a material originating from outer space. Meteorite iron is easily recognized by its high nickel content and other impurities, and these are precisely the traces found in the blade's composition. This means the artisans used a piece of meteorite, but when you stand in a quiet museum hall, looking at the dagger lying under glass, and imagine its journey from the sky into the hands of an ancient artisan, you feel a strange thrill. This isn't just a weapon, it's an object forged from a piece of a star. The most disturbing question is how the ancients knew this metal was different from ordinary metal. They didn't know how to smelt iron back then. The use of iron in Egypt began much later, and during Tutankhamun's time, such items were incredibly rare. So, the craftsmen didn't just find a meteorite. They knew its metal could be worked, that it was unusually strong and capable of holding its shape. Can you imagine a craftsman taking a heavy, dark fragment of stone that fell from the sky and deciding to shape it into a blade for the pharaoh? How many attempts would he have to make before the metal gave in? Even more mysterious is the quality of the workmanship. The blade is perfectly smooth and even, as if crafted by a professional blacksmith who had worked with iron his entire life. But the Egyptians of that time had no such experience. The tools they used were made of bronze, sometimes copper. Iron remained a nearly incomprehensible material. How were they able to work such a hard metal? With what tools? By what method? You look at the blade's mirror-like shine and realize, before you is a thing that doesn't match the technological level of the era. Some researchers suggest that the ancients may have used a technique called cold forging, strikes on metal without melting it. This explains part of the process, but not the quality. The blade is too graceful, too skillful, too precise. It seems as if the craftsman had before him a model, knowledge, or tradition that has not reached us. Perhaps working with meteorites was part of a special ritual, accessible only to a select few. Metal from the sky may have been considered sacred, linked to the gods and the sun itself. There's also a ritualistic significance. In ancient Egypt, celestial iron was called the metal of the gods. It was associated with forces that fell to earth with thunder and light. Imagine priests watching a bright flash in the sky, or finding a meteorite fragment in the sand and considering it a message. A blade made of such metal would have been not only a symbol of power, but also a symbol of the pharaoh's connection with the sky. This weapon was not intended for combat. It was a sign that Tutankhamun was not just a ruler, but a man to whom the forces of the cosmos were drawn. But the dagger's mystery stems from more than just its origin. Where it was found is significant. At the foot of the deceased king, alongside other objects intended for the journey to the afterlife, the dagger lay as if it were destined to accompany the pharaoh into the spirit world, as if it were not a weapon, but a key. Looking at the blade, you realize it could symbolize a path through darkness, a connection between earth and heaven, the ability to navigate the barriers that await the soul after death. Some speculate that the dagger was a gift. Perhaps it came to Egypt from another country where ironworking was well developed, but metal analysis revealed its unique composition. Such levels of nickel are rare in terrestrial iron samples of that era. So, again, a meteorite. Again, a celestial origin. This means that wherever the blade was made, its history still begins beyond Earth. Another important question remains. Was this blade unique, or were other artifacts made of celestial metal, but they simply didn't survive? Some texts mention swords of fire, used by priests in rituals. Perhaps these were not a legend, but reality. Perhaps celestial iron was used more often than we think, but these objects have vanished into the sands of time. What's particularly odd is that the dagger's study was conducted cautiously. First, the metal was examined using transillumination, then with minimal spectrometric methods. When it became clear that its composition was indeed meteoritic, a storm erupted in scientific circles. But then, silence. As if no one wanted to go further. As if the mystery surrounding this blade was never meant to be fully revealed. Standing before the display case containing Tutankhamun's sword, one senses a strange combination of beauty and unease. It's small, almost delicate, yet its material evokes eternity. Meteorites exist for millions of years, outlasting time, civilizations, and extinctions. And when such metal is turned into a blade, it becomes a symbol of humanity's connection to something all too ancient. You walk away from the display case, but the feeling remains. The feeling that before you is not just an artifact, but a trace. A thin, sharp trace between heaven and earth, between the world of people and the world of inaccessible forces. It's a quiet reminder that sometimes the ancients knew more than they thought, or heard what modern man has forgotten how to hear. Tomb of Cleopatra. When you mention the name Cleopatra, the image of a woman who became a symbol of power, strength, and tragedy immediately comes to mind. Her life has been chronicled by countless authors. Her political actions influenced the fate of Egypt, and her death has become the stuff of legend. And yet, the most important part of her story remains hidden. Cleopatra's tomb remains undiscovered. No trace, no entrance, not even a clear clue. It is one of Egypt's most real and most disturbing mysteries. According to ancient sources, Cleopatra was buried with Mark Antony. They are united not only by history, but also by death. But where exactly this happened is a question that has remained unanswered for over 2 millennia. Standing on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea near Alexandria, you begin to understand the scale of the problem. Modern Alexandria stands on the site of an ancient city that has endured earthquakes, fires, landslides, destructive tides, and rising sea levels. This means that even if the tomb existed, it could have been washed away, buried, or hidden under layers of rubble. Some scientists believe the tomb should be sought at the seabed. Underwater exploration in the area of ancient Alexandria has indeed uncovered entire neighborhoods sunken during natural disasters. Statues, columns, and temples have been found there, traces of a city that sank beneath the waves. Looking at these discovered fragments, you realize if Cleopatra was buried near the palace, her tomb could be there too. But the sea hides its secrets well. Even modern equipment can only find isolated clues, pieces of walls, temple foundations, and ruined staircases. There's a theory that Cleopatra was buried not in the city center, but in a sanctuary dedicated to Osiris, not far from Taposiris Magna. This site is located dozens of kilometers from Alexandria. Here, archaeologists have discovered underground tunnels, chambers, and temples dedicated to afterlife rituals. In some rooms, they discovered high-status mummies, jewelry, and the remains of ritual utensils. And yet, nothing can be confidently linked to Cleopatra. Each find is merely a shadow, each clue too weak a hint. What's particularly disturbing is that Cleopatra herself may have been involved in the creation of her future burial site. She knew how unstable the political situation was. She understood that her enemies would want to destroy her memory. Therefore, it's possible that the tomb was built to be impossible to find. Perhaps deep within a temple, perhaps behind hidden passages, perhaps in a chamber accessible only to priests. You can imagine a small group of initiates preparing the site for the queen's final journey by torchlight at night. knowing that their knowledge must die with them. The fate of Cleopatra's body raises even more questions because of her suicide. Legend has it that she died from a snakebite, but scholars still debate this. Perhaps the priests wanted to conceal the cause of death to preserve her memory. But if her death was secret, then her funeral was surely conducted with extreme secrecy. Imagine, the city is on the brink of collapse, enemies are already at the port, and a group of loyalists hides the body of the last queen beneath thick rocks, in a place where no one would think to look. But there's another, more sinister possibility. Some researchers suggest the tomb may have been destroyed in ancient times. The temples located on the outskirts of Alexandria were subject to much destruction. Earthquakes, fires, and military campaigns, all of these could have destroyed or buried the tomb so deeply that its traces became undetectable. If so, perhaps Cleopatra's tomb vanished long ago, leaving only a legend. It's also strange that ancient texts don't provide a precise description of the burial site. Authors, who typically record such events in detail, limit themselves to generalities here. This suggests that the location was deliberately concealed. Perhaps the Romans didn't want the people to venerate the tomb of the last queen. Perhaps her burial site was removed from documentation to prevent the formation of a cult. Sometimes archaeologists in Alexandria find amulets, rings, and figurines associated with the era of Cleopatra. These small objects spark hope. What if the next find turns out to be part of a tomb? But each time, this hope fades. The city is too destroyed, too transformed. Modern buildings stand on top of ancient layers that are impossible to excavate. You understand that some secrets may be literally inaccessible, not for lack of evidence, but because the city continues to live on top of them. The most exciting thing about this mystery is that it's still alive. It can be solved. Perhaps right now, beneath a layer of rock in Taposiris Magna, or beneath the waters off the coast of Alexandria, there lies an entrance that no one has yet noticed. An entrance that could become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. As you walk away from the excavations, you feel as if history itself is watching you. Cleopatra's tomb isn't just a place to be found. It's a symbol of the end of an era, a symbol of a woman who lived her life on the brink of disaster and passed away in such a way that even her death left more questions than answers. And until the tomb is found, its story remains unfinished, like a final chapter, cut short at the most crucial moment. The curse of Tutankhamun's tomb. When talking about Tutankhamun's tomb, most people immediately think of the gleam of the golden sarcophagus, the treasure, and the young pharaoh resting in a perfectly preserved tomb. But behind all this splendor lies a story that evokes a far more difficult feeling. A story of death, strange coincidences, and the fear that gripped the people who were the first to witness the discovery. A story that has been called the curse of the pharaoh. And the deeper you delve into it, the less random the events that occurred after the excavations seem. Howard Carter, the archaeologist who opened the tomb, recalled the first time he saw the sealed door covered with the priest's seals. It was a night filled with anxiety. The air was still. The sand seemed too still. When they made the first small hole in the wall and lit a candle, Carter reported seeing wonderful things. But no one then guessed that these words would set in motion a chain of events that would forever link Tutankhamun's name with the legend of the curse. The first to die was Lord Carnarvon, who had financed the expedition. His death occurred shortly after the tomb's opening. He died of an infection caused by a simple mosquito bite. But in Egypt, such coincidences were rarely dismissed as mere coincidences, especially when, that same night, a rumor spread through Cairo that the city's lights had suddenly gone out. People considered it a sign, and when it became known that Carnarvon's dog in England had suddenly howled and died at that very moment, the story took on a whole new dimension. Reading these events, you sense the atmosphere of those times becoming thick, almost tangible. People began to fear the very idea of interfering with the pharaoh's peace. Newspapers around the world reported on a curse supposedly inscribed on the tomb's entrance. And although Carter found no threatening or warning inscriptions, the very idea of possible vengeance from ancient forces spread like fog across the desert. Interestingly, many of the excavation participants actually died in the following years from illness or accidents, some at a young age, some under strange circumstances. You understand that some of these deaths can be explained by medical conditions, some by age, and some by the dangers of archaeological work. But when such cases become too numerous, alarm arises. All too easily, this chain of events fits into the narrative of a disturbance of the centuries-old peace. There's a more rational explanation. Traces of fungi and bacteria capable of causing severe illnesses have been found in some ancient tombs. The air in the tombs could have contained spores that, if inhaled, could have caused infections. But even if this were true, why didn't everyone fall ill? Why did the disease seem to target specific individuals? Scientists try to explain everything with natural causes, but the legend persists. It lives in the space between chance and fear, between science and the shadow of the ancient world. Particularly noteworthy is the fact that some of the expedition members, including Carter himself, lived long lives. This only heightened the mystique, as if the curse didn't affect everyone, but only those who were particularly close to the moment of discovery. Imagine the night when the archaeologists first entered the narrow corridor covered in seals. Everyone froze, realizing they were witnessing something Egypt hadn't seen since ancient times. And if ancient beliefs are to be believed, disturbing the king's peace was more than just an archaeological act. It was a spiritual intervention. The figure of Anubis depicted on some of the tomb's objects is particularly disturbing. The god who weighs the hearts of the dead was a symbol of transition, and many believed he guarded Tutankhamun's path to the afterlife. When archaeologists began removing objects from the tomb, it seemed as if the thin boundary between worlds was shifting. Those present felt a strange air pressure, and some reported hearing quiet rustling sounds in the darkness. Perhaps this was just a figment of their imagination, but in the deep corridors, such impressions are intensified. Part of the legend is connected to the fact that Tutankhamun's tomb is almost the only one found intact. The others were plundered, and many have asked, did this place really preserve its secret only to remind one of the power of the ancient world? This thought lingers when you see the countless objects created for the journey into eternity. Amulets, figurines, vessels, everything that was supposed to protect the pharaoh from the dangers of the afterlife. Perhaps the ancients truly believed that violators would be punished. But what's most astonishing is that the legend of the curse hasn't faded with the advancement of science. It's grown even stronger. Films, books, and studies all echo the same sentiment. There's something in Tutankhamun's tomb that can't be fully explained. And the more you study the expedition's story, the more you feel that the ancients knew things about death and the afterlife that we can barely imagine. Standing before the young pharaoh's sarcophagus, you feel a strange mixture of admiration and apprehension. His face, hidden by a golden mask, appears calm, almost serene. But around it lie hundreds of objects that were meant to protect him for eternity. And you understand, even if the curse didn't literally exist, the Egyptians' attitude toward death was so serious that the idea of punishing transgressors became a natural extension of their worldview. Leaving the museum hall housing Tutankhamun's mask, you sense that this story is not about death, but about a boundary, about that fine line between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which the ancients never crossed without respect. And perhaps the legend of the curse is a reminder that sometimes the past asks us not to intrude too deeply. Even if it's just a story, it still forces us to listen to the silence. Hidden chambers of the Great Pyramid. As you walk through the narrow corridors of the Great Pyramid, you inevitably get the feeling that you're looking at more than just a funerary structure. It seems as if the stone mask conceals voids, passages, and chambers unknown for millennia. This thought haunts even the most experienced researchers, and it's this very thought that has led to one of Egypt's most intense mysteries, the existence of chambers within Khufu's pyramid that remain inaccessible to this day. The official diagram of the pyramid has long been known. The ascending passage, the Queen's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber, and narrow shafts leading to the surface. But when modern methods, thermal imaging, laser scanning, and muon tomography, were first used, the pyramid was revealed anew, and it turned out that the enormous structure concealed more than any ancient sources could have predicted. One of the first warning signs was thermal anomalies on the outer surface. Some blocks in the eastern part of the pyramid turned out to be significantly warmer or colder than their neighbors, as if there were voids behind them. Scientists repeated measurements again and again, trying to rule out the influence of sun, wind, and air temperature. But the anomalies persisted. Looking at the diagrams of these measurements, you realize there really is something inside. Later, muon scanning revealed a truly astonishing result. A huge, unknown cavity was discovered above the Grand Gallery, so large that it was nicknamed the Great Void. Researchers debated the shape of this chamber. Some believed it was a sloping hall similar to the gallery. Others believed it was a series of accumulated cavities. But everyone agreed on one thing. The chamber was not a random occurrence. It was too large and too level, and too precisely positioned to be a construction defect. The most astonishing thing is that the cavity is not connected in any way to the known corridors. It is inaccessible. To get there, one would have to dismantle the blocks, which is unacceptable. Therefore, the secret remains hidden, as if the pyramid itself is unwilling to reveal its true structure. You can imagine the construction process. Workers lifting gigantic blocks, creating incredibly precise angles and slopes. But why did they leave a void of such magnitude? For unloading, for rituals, for storing objects? Or, most disturbing of all, could there have been a hidden burial chamber there, unknown to us? After all, the sarcophagus in the king's chamber is empty. Perhaps Khufu's body was never there. Some researchers have suggested the existence of hidden passages leading to this unknown chamber. Perhaps the entrance was sealed after the rituals were completed, so skillfully that we simply cannot see it. Supporters of this theory point out that in some places the masonry is unusually dense, while in others it's the opposite, as if there were a joint disguised as an ordinary block. Looking at the reconstructions, one gets the feeling of a complex system designed to conceal the pyramid's main secret. Some believe the shafts served as symbolic paths for the soul, leading to the stars. This makes sense considering that the ancient Egyptians saw the sky as a path for passage. But then why the doors? Why the hidden sections? Why the elements that look not like symbols, but like mechanical parts? You understand that there's a logic to these corridors that defies our understanding. Perhaps the shafts were used during rituals performed before construction was completed. Perhaps objects were placed there that were never meant to see the light of day. Perhaps the shafts were part of a complex system not intended for living beings. Another disturbing fact. After more than 100 years of exploration, no one has found any inscriptions inside the Great Pyramid. It is devoid of texts, paintings, or instructions. It is silent. This makes it even more mysterious. If the stone texts of the Saqqara pyramids explain the path of the soul, then the Great Pyramid seems to store its knowledge within its voids and blocks. There are no words, only structure. Imagine standing in the center of the king's chamber. Enormous granite blocks, perfectly fitted, surround you. The light from your lantern bounces off the smooth surfaces. The silence is so thick you can hear your own heartbeat. And somewhere above you, there's an unknown void. There are hundreds of tons of stone, and yet, within, there's a space carved by the hands of people who lived thousands of years ago, and no one knows why. Some scholars believe the Great Pyramid is more than just a tomb. It was created as a complex combining astronomy, religion, mathematics, and ritual, and the hidden chambers are part of this system. These secret chambers could have been used to train priests, conduct closed ceremonies, or store sacred objects. Perhaps they contain texts that, for some reason, needed to be hidden forever. But there's another thought, a more disturbing one. The pyramid's builders understood that time would destroy everything, and so they ensured that the main secret was hidden so deeply that no amount of destruction could reveal it. The pyramid has survived coups, looters, sandstorms, and earthquakes, but the voids within remain untouched. When you step outside, the sun seems too bright. The pyramid stands motionless, like a huge boulder. But now you realize that inside, it's not monolithic at all. It's like a huge box, with something important hidden inside. And so far, no one has found the key. And this is precisely what makes the hidden chambers of the Great Pyramid one of Egypt's most enticing mysteries. It is silent, but its silence speaks louder than any words. When you look at Egypt's mysteries as a single canvas, you realize that each one is not just a riddle of the past, but the trace of a living civilization that knew how to hide more than it revealed. Beneath the sand, in the depths of stone, and in the silence of ruined temples, answers lie hidden. Answers to which we are still only just beginning to grasp. Egypt doesn't reveal its secrets, it chooses who to reveal them to.